Well, if you lie and you're rewarded for it, the evidence suggests that the lie was worthwhile. But your point is something like, well, what about everything you're excluding? It's like, yeah, what about that? Okay, so what's the religious proclamation with regard to the truth? It's something like this. If you could see things in light of eternity, you would understand that whatever happens to you, if you tell the truth, is the best thing that could have possibly happened, no matter what it looks like at the moment.
But before we get into our conversation, my name is Eric Metaxas, and this channel exists to bring you a biblical perspective on today's news, culture, and hot-button issues. If you're new here or not, welcome, and be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you are notified when new videos get posted. The title of the tour is the We Who Wrestle with God Tour.
Right.
Part of the conversation, part of your lecture, has to do with the question of who is God.
That's what the name Israel means. We who wrestle with God. So
I think I knew that.
Israel is the chosen people of God, and that implies that those who wrestle with God are his chosen people. And you might say, well, what does that mean? And to wrestle with God...
I might say, what does that mean?
Exactly,
For example,
exactly.
Right now, I will say it. What does that mean?
Well, it means that we have to make moral decisions, right? And in ignorance. And so that's always a wrestling. It's always difficult. Conflicts of duty, well, the choice between good and evil, that's obviously one form of wrestling, but the choice between various goods, it's often the case that the most serious conflicts that we have in our life are choices between positive options, for example. It's always a wrestling. It's difficult. And life is that wrestling. And it is that because there's not really much difference between moral decisions and decisions, right? To decide to act in a certain way is to privilege that pathway of action above all others. That's a value judgment. That's a moral decision. Part of what the biblical library is trying to investigate is what is it that should be put in the highest place? I mean, you could argue nothing. You could argue that there's a plethora of goods with no fundamental union. That's not the monotheistic hypothesis. The monotheistic hypothesis is that all value culminates in an ultimate value. And that speaks of something like an underlying unity to being and to becoming.
You know, you sound a lot like Jordan Peterson. Has anyone ever told you that?
Yes, it's very sad.
It's uncanny.
Yeah.
It's uncanny. Just now, everything you said, I said, that's exactly like Jordan Peterson. If you weren't Jordan Peterson, it would be strange. Do you ever find it funny that you're talking about morality, which on some level is extremely basic, right? Sacrifice, do good, don't be a narcissistic jerk. I mean, all of these things, we've fallen into a place in Western culture where this is big news. This is shocking information. And it's part of the reason why so many people are flocking to see you and to hear you and to read your books, because we haven't been getting this message.
We're at a point where the obvious needs to be explained.
The impact of writing on oneself, it's the way you organize your own thinking.
You can lay out what you think. What do I think? You just watch and you think, okay, I have a problem. What do I think about that? I think this, and I think this, and I think this, and I think this, and I think this. And I don't know much about that, but I'm interested, so I better read this, and now I think this. You write all that down, just so you know who you are. And then you think, okay, let's sort this mess out. You create your character with your words. You mark your path forward with your thoughts. Every word matters. Intonation matters. Connotation matters. Poetic beauty matters. And if it doesn't matter, then you're not writing. And if you're not writing, you're not thinking. And if you're not thinking, then you're going to fall into a pit. That's how serious you are if you think words matter. And they matter. They matter more than anything.
I found it particularly fascinating when you were talking about the advent in 1961, I don't think you gave the date, but of the pill. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that, because that seems to me to be a way of framing this
Well, it's easy to
trend,
think. It's
the
easy to
trend.
think of the pill primarily as a technological accomplishment.
Right.
But there is no technological accomplishment independent of its moral frame, because all technologies have a purpose, and anything that has a purpose is in the domain of moral aim, but essentially by definition. So what's the ethos of the pill? Well, in its best manifestation, it would be the allowance for people who are in committed relationships to determine when they're going to have children, so that their children can have the best chance to survive and to thrive. But that's only one part of the ethos, because the other part is pleasure without responsibility. And that, you might say, well, that's fine. But my sense is it's not fine at all. Generally speaking, pleasure without responsibility isn't fine. It's impulsive, immature, and hedonistic. And the reason that's not good is because it can't sustain itself productively across time. Things that sustain themselves productively across time tend to be those paths of action that require sacrifice, delay of gratification, prioritization of the community, prioritization of the future. And that's not commensurate with a hedonistic orientation. Does the pill produce a tilt towards a radical hedonism? Well, obviously, I don't think that's the least bit contentious. How dangerous is that? We don't know.
Although
it might be
seeing
fatal.
now,
What makes you think that there is such a thing as right? You need a reason to move forward in certainty, right? Because otherwise you move forward in doubt. And the problem with moving forward in doubt is you don't move forward. Anything can stop you because first of all, you're not motivated to go because you don't believe in the destination. But second, you're weak, rife with doubt. Virtually anything can stop you. So that's a radical demoralization on the psychological front, but also on the social front. You can't unite yourself in cooperation and competition with other people.
but we're seeing now for the first time, and I think this explains your popularity, that things have been slowly falling apart, but suddenly here we are, and we're living in a world of moral chaos. It is the result, at least in part, of the pill, of the sexual revolution, mostly of the sexual revolution.
But those two things are really inseparable, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have had the pill without a sexual revolution, and vice versa.
What are the antecedents in the 50s and the 40s that you believe led to that moment? Because I don't quite see it. When I think of the Eisenhower 50s, I don't think of a world longing for the technology.
Well, the 50s were more revolutionary than people understand. Like the 60s, in some sense, were the full manifestation of what started in the 1950s. And you had a consumer-oriented society, and that was driven by like capitalist marketing to a large degree. And I'm not precisely complaining about that, but the groundwork for
What's the downside of the free market?
Yeah, well, the downside of the free market is the appeal to immediate gratification. And why is that a downside? Well, because what gratifies you immediately is not necessarily good for the community or for the long run. That's technically the reason. I mean, the reason 2-year-olds can't survive on their own or in groups is because they're too oriented to the moment and not sufficiently oriented to the community or the future. I mean, that's technically the problem. And so you have to substitute for that short-term hedonistic orientation something that has a much broader purview.
What I don't often find fiscal conservatives talking about, people who are fans of the free market, they don't talk about the fact, the inescapable fact, that it's the same as when the American founders talked about self-government. You have to have a moral and virtuous citizenry, or they will simply elect Hitler or Stalin or some other monster. In the free market, it will simply give you, if you are not yourself reasonably virtuous, it will simply give you what you ask for. So we'll get better, cheaper pornography and drugs. So the free market is neutral. It's a wonderful thing, but unless you have a virtuous, moral population, it leads to wicked things.
In the ultimate case, the free market becomes the pool of narcissists, right? Because it offers you what you want instantly. And cell phones are a very good example of that, because they're better and better, and they'll get unbelievably good at this, in figuring out what will maximally attract your attention in the short term. And they'll do that not only by assessing your patterns of attention, your purchasing habits and so on, so that they can predict what else it is that would hook you to your screen, but also offer you what you want, what the impulsive part of you wants now. But they'll develop very rapidly to the point where they're actually tracking your eye movements, for example, and that's a very good index of where you're attending. And we'll be able to predict with increasingly stunning accuracy exactly what it is that can be offered to you to keep you on the platform.
This sounds like a nightmare.
Well, it's already a nightmare to some degree. I mean, it is a weird nightmare, and you pointed that out already. It's like, well, what's the nightmare of being offered exactly what you want when you want it all the time? Well, in some ways, that's the nightmare of cocaine. Cocaine activates the same neural pathways that are activated when you're doing something worthwhile. That's what cocaine does. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, if you obtain that without actually doing something worthwhile, it's not only radically false, but it's radically counterproductive in that it can't sustain itself. And so a descent into the pool of Narcissus is a society that can't, it lacks the moral virtues that you described that enable even a technologically complex society to survive.
Well, I mean, this is where we have to get to, the definition of who are we, what is man, and then later I want to get to the idea of who is God, or at least as you see it. But the question, if you have a kind of lefty, Rousseauian, utopianist view of humanity, you think that we're not fallen, and therefore you don't worry about the things that we're talking about.
As you said, that also is a flaw on the libertarian side. The libertarians might say, well, you can allow people to engage in cooperation and competition in relationship to what they want, and the system will balance itself optimally without governance, let's say.
Yeah.
But the flaw in that reasoning is, who is this you that wants? Like, why is it, this is something that's very germane to our current society. People now identify themselves with their wants. So that means what they do is they identify themselves with something that possesses them, that they think is them. So, for example, if your identity is sexual, well, then what you've done is reduced who you are to the sexual impulse, which essentially means that the sexual impulse is now elevated to the status of God.
And you're less than fully human.
Well, who you are is a very complicated problem. Part of who you are is what the impulses within you want right now. But that's kind of an immature and dangerous part of you, and it isn't obvious at all that you want that to get the upper hand. Then there's the you that makes itself manifest communally. So, for example, if you're a father with a family of children, then who you are is the sacrifice of that whim-predicated individuality to the long-term stability of wife and family, and the inculcation of virtue in the children. That's a much different concept of what constitutes you. And we've been sold, even by the capitalists, let's say, we've been sold this idea that you're best summed up by your desires. That's a very low estimation of what it means to be human. And fundamentally, it's empty. With regard to the pill, we talked about the pill. So the pill offered, the whole sexual revolution, offered endless sexual gratification.
Can we have morality without God? I mean, I would say that we couldn't, but it seems that you somehow are making a case for moral order, but I'm not clear where God is in that.
Either at the apex or at the foundation, depending on the metaphor you use. So the more fundamental the moral injunction, the more sacred it is, and the closer it gets to what constitutes God by definition. The religious enterprise is in the depths of the moral enterprise. It's a matter of definition in some ways. It's that there are moral injunctions upon which many other moral injunctions depend. They're in a hierarchical relationship. I'll give you an example. So there's a story in the Gospels where a lawyer, I think it's a lawyer, might be a scribe, is basically an academic, or a Pharisee, which is a religious hypocrite. So they're trying to trap Christ into saying something heretical so they can get rid of him because he's so annoying. And so they ask him what the greatest commandment is. Now, the reason they ask him that, they're like crooked journalists. They're laying a trap.
Right.
The idea is there's nothing you can say that won't convict you, right? Because no matter what commandment Christ picks, he downplays the other 9, and so they can get him on charge of heresy and have him arrested. That's the game. Well, Christ inverts that game. He steps outside the question, and he says that all 10 commandments are the manifestation of a more fundamental commandment, the great commandment, which is something like love God with all your heart, which means to commit to the highest aim that makes itself manifest to you, and to love other people as if they're yourself. And there's a dynamism. So the first part of that is orient yourself upwards so that your motivation in your actions and your words is to lay out and describe the pathway to the highest possible level of moral accomplishment. And then the next is to extend that horizontally and to make the assumption that every person that you're talking to is equally and implicitly of divine virtue. It's something like that. And Christ's proclamation is that all 10 commandments stem from that meta commandment. Well, so imagine that there's 100 rules, and those rules are derived from 10 commandments, and those commandments are derived from 2 principles. And then imagine there's something underneath that principle that's one thing. That's God, by definition. Now, in the Christian conception of things, that God is represented in multiple ways. But one of the ways that that unifying principle is represented is as the principle of voluntary exposure to pain, betrayal, death, and malevolence. Right, so the hoisting of the cross, the voluntary hoisting of the cross, is assimilated to the unifying spirit. And the claim there is that the willingness to bear the entire existential burden of life voluntarily is the same as the spirit that creates order at the beginning of time. It's a set of propositions. There's a hierarchical relationship. There's something at the bottom or the top, like I said, depending on the metaphor. The thing that's at the bottom is, by definition, God. Now, the monotheistic hypothesis is that the thing at the bottom is one thing, that there's a fundamental unity. Now, there doesn't have to be, hypothetically, there could be a plurality, but the cost of a plurality is confusion, right?
But
So
the way Christians say Trinity, you don't mean Trinity as that kind of plurality.
well, the Trinitarian concept is a reflection of the fact that it's necessary to develop an understanding of the most fundamental principle. It's necessary to characterize it in multiple ways. Let me give an example of that that's not exactly Trinitarian. So what you see in the biblical stories is a series of characterizations of God and man. And each characterization, so that would be each story, sheds a different light on God and man. And with the insistence that under that multiplicity of characterization is a unity. Okay, so here's some examples. So in Genesis 1, God is the spirit that generates the habitable order that is good or very good out of chaos and possibility. Okay, so that's what you do when you organize your family. There's a domain of possibility, and you grapple with that, and you shape it into something that's good. And you do that insofar as you're acting if you do that properly, insofar as you're acting as the proper image of God. So that's the proclamation in Genesis 1. Just slightly after that, God is characterized as the spirit that punishes prideful presumption. Right, okay, so you say, well, do you believe in that spirit? It's like, well, how often have you got knocked flat because of your prideful presumption?
Although, I mean, but couldn't one argue that that is simply the structure of things? That's reality, but there needn't be a God behind it. Of course, I believe there is, but actions have consequences. There are plenty of people who believe that, practically speaking, they see it, but they don't necessarily acknowledge that there's a personal God
Well, that is
behind
the
it.
question. The question is your ultimate relationship with being actually a relationship, right? Well, that's actually a very complicated question, even let's say scientifically. I mean, we're organized at the highest level of analysis as a personality. We exist in relationship to the world. We evolved to exist in relationship to the world. Does that mean that the world is best construed as a place of relationship? Does that mean that the spirit that underlies the world itself is a spirit with whom you have a relationship? It might mean that. It's certainly the case that we act as if it's the case. I'll give you an example of this. So I've spoken with many atheists and many rationalist atheists. And the thing that's very interesting about rationalist atheists is that they're annoyed at God. They're not just rationalist atheists. It's not like they're neutral about God.
Right.
Now, they often have a reason.
Yeah.
The reason very often is that they were hurt by religious hypocrites, right? So not only are they maybe a little bit on the thing interest orientation side of the scale, so they tend to look at the world as if it's mechanical rather than existing in relationship, but they're also hurt. They're hurt by the religious hypocrites and they're angry at God. I mean, I talked to Stephen Fry. This was very notable in Stephen Fry.
Yeah.
He got quite agitated when he was talking about bone cancer in children.
Oh, he always goes there. He goes
Well,
there.
he's morally outraged.
And he seems outraged. And you think, sir, this makes no sense. If there is no God, why would you be outraged? Why, on some level, you could even argue, from where do you get any sense of justice or right or wrong? If we evolved out of the primordial soup by
what grounds?
accident, what are you even? What are you complaining about?
On what grounds are you outraged?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the.
Well, I mean,
question.
I guess he would answer that. If and he says he's not, but he's saying if you or I or anyone else is positing this loving God, this omnipotent God, then to him it is offensive that God would allow these things.
Yeah, but he still doesn't take it personally.
Well, I guess what I first want to say is that we all ought to be able to understand why he's upset, right? In other words, I think we have questions. We have questions, but when people act as though, well, those questions settle it, there's a lot more to the story, because the God of the Bible sent his son to suffer a tortured death, to enter into our suffering. That at least ought to color your picture of the God you're criticizing, Stephen Fry.
Richard Dawkins, for example, has made the case that there's no more barbaric a character in all ancient literature than the God of the Hebrew texts. And the first thing I would say about that is that I just think he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Oh, listen, there is no question he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, not on that side.
No, but listen, I wrote a book called Is Atheism Dead? And my little reading into Dawkins, I am astonished that he is given the platform. That he has had so many preposterous things, really preposterous, that he ought simply not to be taken seriously on any of this. He contradicts himself at every turn. I mean, he should just stick to science. When he gets into philosophy and this kind of thing, I just find it embarrassing, to be quite honest.
Well, the part of the reason that God in the Old Testament has an ambiguous character in some ways is because the world is very morally complex. And so, for example, in the story of Job, God literally bets with Satan to take Job out. And you can imagine that that's a good case study for the hypothetical immorality of God. But you see, if you're a serious biologist and you were trying to understand how it is that a species came to adaptation and understanding, you'd look at a story like that and you'd understand that what the writers of the story were doing was grappling with the fact that there's an arbitrary element to life. Like sometimes you get punished for doing good things. And sometimes you get rewarded for doing bad things. And then the question is, well, how do you maintain your faith in your own existence and in the structure of being itself, given the reality of that paradoxical complexity? And the answer in the story of Job is, You don't get to question the moral order no matter what happens to you. Not least because if you do that, all it does is make it worse. Like Job has every reason to lose faith in himself. His friends tell him that he wouldn't be suffering if he hadn't made some mistake that he refuses to admit to, and to lose faith in God. Job's wife tells him, look, I'm looking at you. You have nothing left but to shake your fist at God, curse him, and die. That's how dire your circumstance is. And Job's insistence is, no matter what happens to me, I will not lose faith. Right, now that's a hell of a thing to say. Now that's expanded massively in the Passion story because a lot of terrible things happen to Job, but it isn't taken to the same extent as it's taken in the story of the
Nor
Passion.
can even Job be thought of as unadulteratedly good as Jesus.
Right. Well, yes, it's clear that Job, although he's a good man, is no more or less than a good man. I mean, there's a resurrection story in Job. I mean, Job gets everything that he lost back and more. And, that's morally ambiguous too, because you might say, well, God isn't justified in torturing you because the ends are positive, right? That's an ends justify the means argument. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that you're required not to lose faith. And you might say, well, all of the evidence suggests that I should lose faith. Well, first of all, you're bringing to the situation an a priori conception of what constitutes evidence that you haven't investigated. You don't get to lose faith. All it does is make it worse. Now, we know this because we see people who are bearing up nobly under extremely difficult conditions, who maintain their moral integrity, despite the fact that they're undergoing the torments of Job. And we find them admirable.
Isn't the idea that those people are have a greater perspective? In other words, I think that when somebody says, oh, things are going terrible, this is terrible, you're not seeing the big picture. You don't know where things will go ultimately. You don't know where things will go eternally.
Yes.
And you're insisting that this is it.
Yes,
that you're going to calculate based on this, and you're somehow insisting that you have the right to do that.
Yes, definitely.
Which is myopic.
With regards to Christ's proclamation that the truth will set you free. Well, you can get into lots of trouble by telling the truth. You can get punished brutally for it. You can get rewarded for lying. Okay, so what do you make of that? Well, if you lie and you're rewarded for it, the evidence suggests that the lie was worthwhile. But your point is something like, well, what about everything you're excluding? It's like, yeah, what about that? Okay, so what's the religious proclamation with regard to the truth? It's something like this. If you could see things in light of eternity, you would understand that whatever happens to you, if you tell the truth, is the best thing that could have possibly happened, no matter what it looks like at the moment. Now, that's brutal because it can look like death, and you might say, well, how do you reconcile that? And the answer to that is, well, you're pushing beyond the limits of human understanding when you ask a question like that. But it's certainly, I can't see how it can be any other way than there's no better pathway forward than the one specified by the truth. I mean, to posit an alternative to that is to make the assumption that you can wander through the territory with a faulty map. Well, no. Now, that doesn't mean you won't pay a price for telling the truth, but it'll be the lesser price. At worst, it'll be the lesser price.
I think it's interesting because people like Job who kind of hang on to their faith in the midst of suffering, we often praise them. I mean, it's when I talk about Bonhoeffer, people say, oh, how can he be? He was so noble. He was so courageous. And my answer to that, and I'm just curious what you think, to my mind, it's not necessarily noble in the sense that they know God to be real. They know that they can trust God. It's not like they're hanging in there hoping I might be wrong. They have some deeper sense that God is God and he is true, and they can't see any other way of processing it. So I don't see Bonhoeffer as being so much courageous as being full of knowledge that God is real. And so it looks like courage to people who aren't sure whether God is real. But for him, it's simply, this is reality. I know God is real.
Yeah.
I know this is the right path.
Yeah.
I can't imagine any other path.
Yeah. Well, it's complicated, because to some degree, that knowledge, let's say, that the truth will set you free, could be defined as the willingness to stake yourself on that proposition, right? Because you'll live in accordance with that dictate, and you'll take the slings and arrows that go along with it. So the knowledge is actually a reflection of that commitment, and that's a form of faith. So that's the part that's, I suppose, bounded by human ignorance. I'm going to step forward with the truth, regardless of what happens, and I'm going to reveal, by doing so, my commitment to my belief that the truth will set you free. The belief is actually manifested in the commitment. Now, the other part of that is the part that you referred to more directly, which is you want to have your fears in order. People have commented to me, told me that they admire my bravery. And I think I appreciate that, although it's embarrassing to be praised. But it's also not exactly right. I'm way more afraid of losing control of my tongue than I am of whatever idiot bureaucrats can array against me to make my life, nominally miserable. Because I know what happens when people live a lie. I know it. Things degenerate into hell. That's what happens. And way faster than you think, and way more because of your lies than you would like to understand. So if you know that, well, then it's a matter of having your fears in order. I suppose that's part of the rationale for proclamations such as the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. What's the notion? Nothing is hidden that won't be revealed. Well, that's another thing to be terrified of.
It's about knowing that evil will be dealt with. God is a judge, and that this wickedness will be revealed as wickedness. That it's not that they won't get away with it. That's part of the calculation.
That would be faith in the fundamental justice of being and becoming, right? And of course,
I wouldn't put it that way, but sure.
The problem is time frame, obviously.
Yeah.
But time frame is a problem. But the fact that time frame is a problem is part of the reason that faith is necessary.
Why is faith necessary? You could just let the facts speak for themselves. It's like, well, the facts don't speak for themselves. And faith is necessary because you have to step forward into the unknown, right? You don't know what's going to happen. You have to determine if you're going to be guided by the principles that you uphold.
When you talk about faith, I always just find myself going to this spot where I think that we can make it seem like faith is this white knuckle, like I'm hanging in there, I have faith. But God wants us, and this is clear in many places in Scripture, he wants us to know that he is real and that he can be trusted, so that we actually know. Not that I hope, but that I actually know, so that in the midst of the suffering, I know that he is with me, that I can depend on him. Not that, gosh, I hope it's true, but that I actually know. I think that God wants us to know that it's true.
You learn that progressively. So for example, if you're in psychotherapy and you're called upon to confront things that terrify and upset you, exposure therapy, let's say, what you learn in the course of exposure therapy is that the degree to which you can tolerate the slings and arrows of fortune is proportionate to the courage that you manifest when you make the encounter. But what's interesting that also happens is that they don't get less afraid, you see, not exactly. What they do is get braver. They get braver. That's not the same thing. Because if you're brave, you continue to advance even if you're afraid. If you're not afraid, you're just not afraid. It's way better to be brave. So what happens with exposure therapy is that bravery generalizes. So people, if you expose people to what they're afraid of in the form of an elevator, they start to confront all sorts of things they were avoiding. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Well, that's how people learn to walk with God. Because what they find is that if they throw themselves into the fray of life, that they make contact with something that enables them to bear the burden. And the promise of faith, this is what the crucifix symbolizes in some fundamental sense, is that to the degree that you're willing to voluntarily enter the fray, God will be with you. It's a matter of definition. You see, that's the thing, is that God in that scenario is the spirit that enables your bravery in the face of danger. It's a definition. Well, what is that? Well, the answer to that is, well, we don't know. In the final analysis, it's something ineffable, which is always the claim about God in the Old Testament anyways.
I want to get to that. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, Moses, who's about as close to God as you can get, sees his back, and that's it for an instant,
but
right?
if he'd hung around another 1,400 years, he could have seen his front, don't you think?
Well, that's the proclamation.
You know, the ineffability of God, God in the New Testament, God reveals himself in the person, I mean, this is what Christians believe, in the person of Jesus, to give us the ability to see God in that way, in a very different way than he reveals himself in the Old Testament. Although in the Old Testament, let's face it, he reveals himself as a friend, as someone with whom certain figures have a relationship. They talk to him.
See, that's the mystery, is the relationship element to it, right? And so this is one of the things that the more materialist atheist types really have a problem with, the notion that our fundamental mode of being is relational. I think you can make a very strong case that our fundamental mode of being is relational. And if that's the mode of being that moves us forward most appropriately in the world, then I could think you can also make a strong case that that's because it mostly deeply reflects the structure of reality itself.
It reflects also the structure of God, because if God is, one God in three persons, from before time in eternity, God was in a relationship with himself. The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit were in relationship before time began. You so brilliantly are able to look at any story or many stories, but also particularly what you call the corpus of the Bible, and to pull out archetypes and patterns and things. In the Bible, these things, which can be seen as metaphors and archetypes, are also in many cases literal. When Jesus was casting out demons, they were actual demons. That this wasn't an idea. In other words, this is not, and I don't know whether you agree with this, but the idea is that there are literal demons and angels, and that's...
Well, the only thing I would just ask you about in relationship to that is, what do you mean by literal?
I mean that there are creatures, that there are demonic creatures, that there are spirits, dark spirits, just as there are angels, and they're actual created beings. I mean, this is the basic biblical view that, when Jesus was casting demons out, that they were actual demons, that there are actual demons, that they're fallen angels, that there's this created order, this invisible created order. And so when Jesus does, I mean, of course, it makes, modern materialistic thinking people, even materialistic Christians, it makes them uncomfortable, this idea. It seems very medieval, but I don't think there's any way you can read Jesus doing
here's
that.
One way of thinking
that where they're anything but actual demons.
Well, one of the ways of thinking about that is that it's very difficult to invite one idea into your soul without inviting the entire host of associated ideas, right? And that the host of associated ideas is something that's reasonably conceptualized as alive. The demon question is it's something like, how do we conceptualize the reality of active ideas that exist in the transcendently personal space, right? I mean, we have notions of Satan, for example, that are independent. They will be around a lot longer than any of the people that hold the ideas.
Right.
Well, and are they real? Well, they certainly depends on how you define real.
But that's the point. Is I think it's both, and I think it's facile to say it's exactly this or exactly this. I think sometimes it's complicated. I mean, I think that sometimes
It's definitely complicated.
it's no different. I mean, there are people who have demon possession. That's a real thing. They can also have, somebody can, through tremendous wounding early in their life, open a door to the demonic. We're talking about many things at once. So I think there's some people that want to make it's exactly this, and others it's exactly this. These are difficult things. We're dealing with invisible things, and I'm grateful for your willingness to just kind of think about it, to try to reason. What is this? What is at play?
Well, you see, as a psychologist, you see people who are possessed by their whims. You see people who are possessed by bad ideas. You see in your own life how straightforward it is to be possessed by rage or resentment. You see that you invite all sorts of terrible things along for the ride when you allow that to happen. You could imagine what would happen if you dwelled on it, if you stayed bitter and resentful in your fantasy for thousands of hours, which people will do.
Right.
You have no idea how dark the places they go can become. Really, people have no imagination for this sort of thing at all. It's unbelievably dark, and it's dark to the point where it's only properly describable in religious terminology, because it is something that gets to the heart of what constitutes evil itself. So that's all true. What that means in relationship to the demonic, I would say, well, when you ask such questions, you push yourself right to the limits of what it is that's possible for us to understand. And so my knowledge fades out at that point. You're absolutely right that people can invite very dark things in to inhabit them. And people do that. And you know that that's wrong when you do it. You start to dwell self-righteously on your bitterness and resentment. You feel that you're justified.
Yeah.
Then you start to harbor feelings of resentment and nurse the corresponding requirement, even moral requirement, for vengeance. And that can take you very rapidly to a place where you're fantasizing about murder. And that's just when the party starts.
Right. I want to ask you, just before we go, because I want to be sensitive to your time, your wife recently, whom I've had the privilege, Tammy, to meet a few times, has been public about her embrace of Christian faith. At one point, you were talking about how the crucifixion is the second part. God lays the foundation, and the crucifixion opening oneself up to that kind of thing. Do you think Jesus could have done that without being God? In other words, it's interesting because we're not talking about.
Well, I would say that the more you do that, the closer you get to God. And the insistence in the Christian story is that there's a limit case there, and the limit case is the identity between man and God. Now, I always try to talk about things practically, insofar as that's possible. Well, you know that you become more than you are by challenging yourself. Well, more than you are implies that you're moving towards some ultimate realization, right? You're on the pathway to some ultimate realization. You may never get there, but you're on the pathway. The fact that we believe that we can improve is an indication of our belief in that. We all know that we improve as a consequence of challenge. We know that. Well, the Christian story, at minimum, is the consequence of adopting the ultimate challenge. Well, the insistence in that story is that the more of the challenge you undertake, the more you walk with God. Well, I think in some ways that's self-evident, because the contrary hypothesis is the more you shrink away, the safer you are. Well, no one believes that.
Right.
Okay, so does that mean that you can confront everything? Well, what does Christ confront? Well, he confronts death, right? But much more than that, painful death, like maximally painful death, at the hands of a multidimensional tyranny of imperial state plus mob, plus the mob of his own people, and then multiple forms of betrayal, including the betrayal of his best friend and his own people, and then betrayal in favor of those known to be criminal, even though those who choose the criminals know that they're choosing the criminals and that he's innocent. Like, it's a limit story. And in that the story of Christ is the story of the confrontation with everything tragic and malevolent that life has to offer.
Right.
And the idea is that if you don't shrink away from that, then God will walk with you while you undertake that. And the more responsibility and challenge we take on voluntarily, the more our characters develop. Well, what's the limit case? Well, the Christian passion is the limit case. So is it true? It's a stupid question, because when you ask questions
Then let me
about,
ask it, is it true?
it's a definition of truth.
It's a definition of truth. I mean, Jesus
It's a way of conceptualizing. He says, I am the
But he
truth
says, I
and
am
the way
the
of
way,
the
the
life.
truth, and the light.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
you know, this is the famous
yeah.
C.S. Lewis trilemma. I want to use the word trilemma, that he's either Lord, lunatic, or liar, because a morally
Right.
beautiful
Yeah, it's a crazy
human
thing to say,
being
man.
could never claim to be the truth.
Yeah, that's a
could claim
wild
to forgive
statement.
sins, whatever, unless he actually were truth.
I am
Otherwise,
the way,
you'd
the
say
truth, and
he's
the life,
crazy.
and no one comes to the Father except through me.
Yeah, only a lunatic would say that, or an arrogant monster, unless it were actually true. I mean, I don't know how you get
Well,
out
even
of that.
then, it's such a strange thing to say that it's not exactly the sort of thing that you would presume that a manic would say, like a grandiose manic. It's not. It doesn't have the flavor of grandiose mania. It's something much stranger than that. And there's something very, very profound about it, which makes its interpretation even more complex. The idea is that you discover your identity with the spirit God of your ancestors by undertaking the adventure of your life. That's the claim. And the adventure of your life is your voluntary confrontation with all the conditions of life. And the promise there is that if you, like Abraham, if you take that on wholeheartedly, something will make itself manifest within you that will continually transform your character upward, really in an unending manner, that will make you more and more capable of thriving in the world now and tomorrow and forever. And I just think that's true. Now, what it means in the final analysis that is true, I don't know, because I don't know how to conceptualize, like, what's the relationship between the soul of man and God? Well, that's the same question it's something like, what's the ultimate meaning of the cosmos? It's like, well, who knows? That isn't something that anyone can straightforwardly say. One answer is to bear the cross upward toward the holy city of Jerusalem. And there's something to be said about that manner of interpretation. Does the cosmos itself depend on that?
Yes,
There's
but we
a
don't have time to get into it.
Well, it's a way of looking at things. And here we are, embodied in our mortal form, so to speak, in this immense expanse of time and space. That's the reality that surrounds us. What's the significance of our life? Well, if you reduce us to the merely material, then nothing. But who's to say that a priori reduction is the right move? The Christian assumption is there's no difference between the human fate and the meaning of the cosmos. Well, insofar as we're people, that's definitely the case. What does that mean in reality? Depends on how you define reality. If you define it as a materialist, it means nothing. Well, go ahead and see what happens. What happens? We know what happens is the bottom drops out of the world. Meaning disappears from the world. And then people can't sustain themselves. They become nihilistic or they tilt in an ideological direction.
The problem with talking to you, Jordan Peterson, is that the more I talk to you, the more I want to talk to you. And that's just a problem because we have a limit. I would like to talk to you for much longer. I know we're out of time. let me simply say thank you. Congratulations on the tour, the We Who Wrestle with God tour. And congratulations on wearing a jacket louder than my own. Not easily done. God bless you, sir. Thank you.
You bet, man. Thanks for the invitation.